Hey everyone. So today we have Mark, the founder of Singapore's Fractional Directory, as well as a fractional professional himself. Now, let me give you the why of this episode first. And this why is the region, as well as what does the future look like for the future of work. Now, for those that nerd out in innovation and future-proofing type circles, then you're very familiar with the term regional leapfrogging. What this means is that certain regions leapfrog other regions in the way that they apply the tech in a way that then the others have to catch up. Now, a very good example of this is if you look at things like cell phones or payments. And my experience, so I lived in Asia for a while, and one of the reasons was when I first went there in 2016, I went, holy crap, they're 10 years ahead of us in many, many ways. Now, we're still ahead. And when I say we, I mean US and Europe and the traditional flexible workforce. We are still ahead in terms of freelance adoption, flexible talent adoption, and how companies are thinking about this strategically. But regions like Singapore, China, even Vietnam, Indonesia, and that Southeast Asia area, they have characteristics that are absolutely leapfrogging what the future of work can look like. What do I mean by that? So we sponsored Singapore's first ever fractional and flexible workforce study. And what we found was fascinating. In the US and in Europe, freelance, flexible, and independent work typically gets looked at as execution/individual contributor based. Whereas in Asia, it seems like they might be leapfrogging in terms of that 5 to 15 year promising potential executive. That is who is freelancing and going independent in Asia, and companies are looking for that individual from a flexible talent capacity. Now, this is a monumental leap, because if we think about it, the flexible workforce typically looks like a dumbbell economy, meaning older executives, instead of retiring, go and have these boutique advisory firms, or the young or the new entry is doing that. That's not the case anymore. And in this episode, we're going to blow the doors off in terms of what the freelance and flexible talent workforce will look like in Asia in the next 5 years. Last thing with Mark is he's running a very innovative business model. And what's funny is what's old is new, meaning that rather than having a typical freelance marketplace and platform, he's intentionally having a fractional directory. Now, you'll learn what that means in this episode. So, without further ado, whether you are in Singapore, whether you're here in the US, whether you're over in Europe, whether you're in Eastern Europe, which has seen 200% plus demand, no matter where in the world you are going to learn how Asia is one of the fastest growing regions and might be creating the actual future of work. All right, enjoy this episode. All right, Mark, listen, thank you for hopping on. Has this been a year in the making, Mark? How long have we been trying to flirt this one out?
I think we connected sometime sort of mid to late summer last year, so probably almost a year. And I know it's a lot going on both sides for this one.
Yeah, and the time zones. I mean, for you listeners out there, Mark's in Singapore. All you listeners know that I'm probably very jealous of you, Mark. Yeah, I've told you that many times. I absolutely love Singapore. But figuring out the time zones is pretty tough because it's 7 a.m. your time right now, right?
That's right. Yeah, we're just past 7.
That's what. Okay, yeah. So you always gotta, who wants to go later or early? Take your pick. But Mark, let's just start a quick intro on yourself. I'm so pumped to talk about not just fractional, but actually the company side of what's required to innovate and change when it comes to talent, fractional and freelance and independent talent. But let's just do a little intro on yourself, Mark.
Sure, sounds good. So I'm originally from the US, but I've been in Asia for almost 20 years now. I came over to do my degree and sort of never made it back. I spent the first 7 years at American Express, pretty much journeying around the world. I was in Hong Kong for a bit, in Canada, the UK, and then back to Singapore. And most of that time was spent working on loyalty and rewards kinds of products. So membership rewards, their credit card rewards points program, co-brand credit cards, all of that space. Fantastic place to learn, really interesting company, and wouldn't trade it for the world. But by 7 or 8 years in, I figured that I really wanted to do something a little bit faster and more innovative, especially in this region where it's not necessarily the key strategic focus. So I launched my own strategy consultancy, still in the reward space. Ran that for about 5 years, then joined that into a fast growth startup in loyalty tech. So there's obviously a strong loyalty theme here. But started moving more and more into the startup space. The venture I did after that loyalty tech company, we grew to about 200 employees while I was there, and it's actually sort of on track for IPO at some point. But I left to do something a little more Singapore focused, built a coalition multi-partner program here in Singapore. And when I left that, thought about where I really wanted to be. And two factors drove me into this flexible workspace, I think. One is I'd spent the last 10 years, by that point, working with startups and really enjoying the 0 to 1, 1 to 10 parts of the journeys. Now, those parts of the journeys typically require an awful lot of sacrifice in terms of the amount of time and the amount of investment that you make as a founder or an early stage employee. I wasn't necessarily in the life stage for that anymore, which leads to the second reason I chose this flexible approach. I had a new and relatively young family, and I really wanted to focus my time on them. The grind of working until 8 or 10 o'clock at night is something that I really wanted to optimize my way out of. And I think in addition to that, I made a choice not to travel. And in a market like Singapore, which is very small and hyper-connected, those are unusual choices to make. So those led me to flexible work and fractional specifically, because I realized the value proposition for startups and early stage companies is actually very clear. Being able to hire somebody who's got the senior experience, but at a much lower budget that would normally only get you a couple of years of experience, perhaps, it makes an absolute game-changing difference in commercial functions, strategy functions, the areas where I've always specialized. So I kind of realized the right place, the right time, the right phase of life all came together for this. And I've been running as a fractional commercial exec or chief of staff since 2023. In that process, I also launched Singapore's Fractional Directory, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later.
Yeah, let's get straight to that. So you mentioned, you're both fractional executive and fractional directory, or let's get deep into like double click what you're doing right now.
Yeah, and it's probably about a quadruple click because there's so many things going on. I think the term I really like that one of my friends and colleagues here has coined for the region is portfolio career. We're all assembling different aspects of who we are and what stimulates us intellectually, financially, into some kind of a coherent whole. And I think the way we did that decades ago was always to pick one job, and then maybe you had a great hobby. Then it transformed into a side hustle that maybe makes you a little bit of extra money. And where we've gotten to these days, you can actually really design a mix of things. So my mix started to include the fractional directory when I realized that the network effects in the fractional space are incredibly important. I'm valuable in my domain and my expertise, but I would have founders come to me and say, can we get a fractional CTO or fractional CMO? And I'd say, sure, I know a couple of folks who might be good for that. If those didn't match because they didn't really gel with the founder or because their specific niche isn't quite right for what that founder needed, then my network value drops very quickly. And I realized that we have to self-organize to some extent because there's no recruitment function that's figured out fractional yet. There's no single place to find these people. It's very much been referral driven. And so I started thinking around the idea. Can we do a collective or cooperative? We don't want to recreate an agency model necessarily. We don't want to have people on payroll, but we do want to be able to link demand side, employers looking for talent, with supply side, all of these people in the market. And so I stumbled across this directory that had been built in New Zealand called, easily enough, the Fractional Directory, and thought, hey, that's actually pretty close to what I had in mind. So I just rang up the founders and said, I think we should be internationalizing this because there's a real opportunity. And they said, yes, we've been thinking about that. And I said, how about Singapore? Let's go there for the next market. And so I took over as general manager of that directory, working with them to bring it in and launch it. And we launched in September 2024. So it's been just a little under a year now. But that is one of my fractional gigs. I always joke that I am the fractional GM of the Fractional Directory. So, living the talk.
Living the truth. No, I think there's a theme and an element that is interesting is that these these flexible kind of first, I'd call them, businesses. And it's everything, to be honest, from it's, hey, I'm building an agency to I'm building a flexible talent platform. But I don't want to say they're an easier business because like no business is easy at all. But the typical decision of full time employment or go build a startup, that is such a those are two extremes, right? And so this thing in the middle, which I would argue, I mean, I've this is like my fifth company that I've started, so I've just kind of always built companies. But the number one thing you need to do in building a good company is be close to your customer.
Yep.
And that close to your customer, that's really hard, especially when you start talking with VCs and you start going down the entrepreneurial route. Because, I mean, someone will give you $1 million because you have a good pitch deck. But the reality is, if you're not close to your customer, right, you're going to get found out eventually. And I think a flexible business, whether it's you being fractional or freelancing or whatever, I mean, you're the closest, right? Like you are literally getting as close as possible to the end customer and actually figuring out what they really need. So that's one theme that, I think is really different. And I'd love to talk about, there's two things. The first is the state of Asia, because we are seeing very unique elements and dynamics. We were just in, like I mentioned, London, France, and Germany, giving sort of a global state of the freelance economy and the flexible workforce. And one of the big aspects that we touched on when we looked at sort of what's on the horizon, obviously there was AI. Fractional was also one of them. But one element was regional leapfrogging, specifically how Asia seems to be skipping a lot of the steps that happened here and in the US and Europe. Because in the US, we've been a freelance first economy when we talk about the flexible workforce. And it seems like in Asia, it's actually a fractional first. So it seems like you've kind of skipped ahead, just like other technological advancements, right? Like you go to China and Singapore, the first thing you think as an American is like, oh my God, they're 10 years ahead. But so that's one angle, we're going to talk about is, hey, what's going on in Asia? What's going on in Singapore? Second angle is slicing and dicing. When we say fractional, when we say freelance, when we say flexible, whatever, how the hell do we slice this up? So
Yep.
I'm going to let you pick which one you want to start with, either slice and dicing or state of Asia. But you go, Mark. Pick which route you want to go first.
Yeah, let's start with the slicing and dicing because I think this always comes up. And there's a lot of ways to look at this flexible space. Um, we've aligned on this in the way we run our business to a definition of fractional leadership, which comes out of the Fractional Leadership Alliance. It's a group, an industry sort of body that was created in the last 18 months to try to make some sense out of this chaos, especially around the term fractional. Because you do hear people say often, isn't fractional just the same as freelance? Or aren't you just putting a fancy word on part-timers? So we've actually created, and I'll be happy to share it in the resources, we've created a guide of this is what we think fractional leadership means. This is where it differs from advisory, from interim, and from consulting. Those are the big four kind of areas that people tend to conflate quite often. That, as you pointed out earlier, that is just the tip of the iceberg on the way people are choosing to work flexibly. It happens to be the part that we're after in terms of stimulating the market and explaining it. And we believe that a common definition in public for companies to understand is going to be one of the key factors that helps this market grow and stabilize, because we see the supply is well developed and actually a lot of people operating. The demand side is still patchy and incoherent. And we think that having a common definition and a common set of understandings and toolkits is going to change that story and really change the game. And we hit our tipping point when that happens. So there are people working on different models of flexibility. There are people working on gig economy, which has been there for ages. But we're focusing specifically on senior fractional leaders who embed themselves into those companies and who are really a team member driving both strategy and execution on a long-term or at least medium-term basis. That's the definition we've chosen. With that, I would say what's out there in public and what the billboards say is always a little different from the individual conversations. And I see this with hiring demand side companies all the time, right? What they need to solve dictates how we solve it. You don't go in with a hammer waving it around and saying, can I change your light bulb for you? So almost every fractional in this region is open to structuring a deal for advisory, structuring a deal for some other kind of way of flexible working. I think there's a lot of flexibility, flexibility in the way we work flexibly. And that's, I think, really important to understand what's happening below the waterline, but at the same time to bring it together at a really high level, simple to understand message for companies, because companies really don't care to solve all the challenges of logistics and what you call yourself. All they want to get in is the right person for the task or for the project or for the long term that they need to solve for. So that's where I see the slicing bit.
Let me ask you a really quick question. So interim versus fractional, what's the difference?
Interim is usually defined fixed term. Maternity leave cover is the easiest example for that. And we break it out a little bit more granularly on the Fractional Leadership Alliance website, but there's generally a little bit less involvement on the strategic side and a little bit more execution in the status quo. You think about, in this region, mat leave is generally 4 months. In the US, I know they don't even bother with mat leave cover because it's so short. But then you go to somewhere like Australia, it can be up to 18 months. So there's obviously a variation depending on how long the person is in role. But in one of my roles right now, I'm consulting and I'm working with a mat leave cover who's an interim. And we've talked about how much they want to do of the previous person carrying the torch forward versus how much they want to make a strategic impact in their role, knowing that they're gone by the end of the year and that there's no, not to say no incentive, but there's no long-term benefit to rocking the boat unless it's really for the good of the company. You wouldn't make a huge play on that where you're not necessarily going to have the budgets, you're not necessarily going to be able to execute, and you haven't ever aligned with the person who's taking over that role in the past. That happens in full-time roles too, but I think it's a little bit different when it's an interim because you're actually often told to color within the lines.
Yeah. So okay, so you'd say the real difference is if continuation, and I'm going to say because of positive change, then it skews more fractional. And let me ask you a funny question. So, and here's where looking at the company side. So the supply is there, right? There's plenty of fractional individuals. The demand is not there, but in the middle, the platforms are there. And so if an interim platform is making $100 million placing interims that looks like fractional, do you care? Do you care that they're still calling them interim?
No, I don't care what they call them. The FLA may care, so I have to carefully divide this. And I'm not an FLA member. I want to be clear about this. I help them facilitate meetings, and I have been familiar with their discussions, but I'm not a formal member. They're looking for, they are comprised of agency of fractional members. So they're very much at that kind of like the direct marketing association level, creating a trade body, not looking for individual fractionals to join. I don't personally care what companies are calling the people they hire, as long as it's polite and respectful. But I do care that we're developing a normalization of this flexible way of working, because I think that benefits everybody. I think that benefits the employer, the human capital, the employee, the human capital side of things. I think it benefits the human capital side of things because people have demonstrated that they don't want to work in the old models. And I think it benefits companies as well, because the need for efficiency, the need to rethink the way you hire, train, compensate people is never greater than it's been, perhaps since the Industrial Revolution. We do not need a 40-hour work week. We do not need defined job structures in the way that we used to need when you were screwing widgets into a automotive frame. We've got robots that do that now, and we have for many years. That disruption to those kinds of industries has already happened, but we've now got the equivalent for knowledge work. With AI coming in, with the kinds of tools that have been created, the need for 40-hour defined knowledge work has changed. And companies that realize that can become more capital efficient. They can really think through, and they can increase their productivity. They can lower their labor costs. That's an absolute necessity. It's a burning platform with where we are right now in the world, the economy, the uncertainties that we're facing. So I really don't care what we call it, as long as people are embracing this flexible methodology of working and getting the benefits that I think they deserve and need out of it. And I am referring to the company side as well as the employee side.
Yeah, no, so it's interesting because so fractional first came on our radar about a year and a half ago. And by our radar, meaning, okay, there started to be a blip in terms of the interest. Now, when we looked at it first, we said, okay, what is different, right? And we always go based off what the companies say. And the startups and SMBs, and this is in US and Europe, the startups and SMBs did see a difference. The enterprises, though, actually would turn around and say, no, 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 no. We need to work with our approved vendors, which usually meant the big consultancies, the staffing firms, those that handled it. Now, the tripwire that I see is the enterprises always need that layer in the middle, right? And they always need the third party relationship, indemnification coverage, all that. With that said, that layer in the middle doesn't look fractional. It typically looks more like consulting, right? Or prior interim because of the legacy. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. One of the interesting applications we've seen is, you're familiar with Catalan, right? The consulting platform. So
Yep.
100,000 plus, independent consultants. And of those, about, a couple thousand are coming in as partners.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
that's fractional, right? Like that is totally fractional if they're replicating a McKinsey partner. But I don't know if they're going to call it that, right? They might just call it an independent partner. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how it plays out. Now, getting deep into the company side, whatever we want to call this, right? We can call them independent workers, self-employed, independent contractors. Honestly, Mark, external worker sounds so boring, but like that seems to be good enough.
It's a technical, literal description. Absolutely.
It's like external independent contractors, probably like the safest legal term that you can use. But in the company side, what do you see as the top 3 values that companies are gravitating towards and actually making a change, meaning actually going and hiring these individuals? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I'll caveat that with is 2 things I'll caveat that with. One is, in this region, it is definitely a little bit different than what we've seen in the US or seen in Europe. The second caveat is, I fully agree with your point around larger companies being less well equipped to bring these people on board at the current state of play. So when I speak about this, it is still the startup and SMB kind of company that's seeing the benefits. The benefits I see, three is what you asked for. I'd say the first one is clearly the flexibility.
2 or 5. I mean, no limit here, man. It's whatever gets them to spend. So
top 20 benefits, or Letterman style. But I think the first one is the flexibility. I think the fact that the world is evolving so quickly and so unpredictably means that you need specialized expertise more quickly, but you may need it in a deep subject matter area for longer, and you need it to be embedded into your organization. The consultant model, right, if we draw back the curtain, has always been that you hire somebody who has done an amazing job of convincing you that they know everything about everything. And then they quickly go off and they find an actual expert to educate them so that they sound smart when they have to go down to the next level. Now, that may be a little cynical, and I love consultants. I have many friends who are in that space. But that's not quite the same as deep expertise unless you're really hiring that McKinsey partner with 20 years of experience in telco for your telco business. Otherwise, you're getting typically a team that's one chapter ahead of the students in terms of the textbooks. I think you do better with fractional in that space. So the value driven and the fact that you can hot swap that without having a long contract, without having 6 figures of commitment makes a huge difference, because we've all seen projects that were delivered on a consulting framework where by the time the actual 300-page document was delivered, the business need had changed. And that document ends up becoming a doorstop. So I think those are the two key for me: the deep access to expertise, the fact that you can hot swap that value and you can actually get what you need at any given moment. And that's more towards flexible than fractional, perhaps, but I think it applies to both. And the third one is just the cost benefit is so completely different when you start thinking that you're defining the value to the company. Most fractionals in this region price based on value, based on the outcomes that they're delivering for the company. And so it's really clear. If I'm hiring this person for 10K, I'm getting 10x the value, or I'm getting 100x the value out of the work that they're putting in per month. That is a value proposition that's far, far better than full-time employees, sorry to say. And it's also better than what the consultancies can provide, because when that collaboration works, it goes on month in, month out. New sources get unlocked along the way. And when it stops working, then you just move on. And both sides are aware of that up front, right? This at-will way of working actually benefits both sides of the relationship. And I've seen this in my fractional business where the relationship evolves. I do some advisory work in early stage. They get funded. They bring me on as a fractional. Then we work together. They ask if I'll go full time. I say no. Then, then from there, we work together until we have pretty much mission accomplished state. And then I help them find the person who's going to take them to the next stage if it's not me, because I know where my boundaries lie. And I will happily fire a client when I'm done with what I can provide for them. I'd rather fire them happy than have them decide to fire me unhappy. And I think a lot of fractionals think along those lines. So this creates just so much more openness with a company that's using this model and fully embracing it.
Let's dig into the challenges, because one of the toughest parts about this space is that the benefits are so obvious and they're so big. It's not like we're saying, hey, you're going to save 5%. Like, no, we're saying like 10x better cost, speed, quality, and access to expertise. You probably can't have unless it's in a fractionalized capacity. But so before we hit that though, I have a really quick question. And are you seeing fractional teams / micro networks? The reason I ask that is this: when I look at fractional, my biggest weakness that I see in it is that I don't want 100 executives. I want probably 2 executives or 1 executive for every 20 workers. And so when I look and I see people being like, oh, fractional is the future, yada, yada, I'm like, maybe if they know how to leverage seriously crazy AI tools that they never ever need a team or anything. But to me, the reality looks more, and this is how we, actually are fully staffed at Human Cloud, is like we have leadership that they can call themselves fractional or whatever. We know they have micro networks of freelancers, which that's how we kind of define, by the way, Mark. So like if small task based, then gig. If IC based, meaning independent contractor or individual contributor based, then we call it freelance. And then if strategy plus execution, we call it fractional. But so are you seeing the teaming aspect or the micro networks within these fractional individuals?
We're seeing something interesting, which is actually we're seeing SWAT teams of fractionals. So the micro networks that are existing are actually people who say, I'm going to come in with 2 or 3 other trusted people in this niche, and we are going to remake your company. And I think it's too early to say whether that's going to work. But I think it's the aggressive move that I've seen made and marketed is I can bring you a team that's going to solve your commercial, solve your marketing, solve your product problems. And, if I just use those 3, we 3 will come in all fractional for the cost of 1 senior leadership full-time hire. And we will make your business so much better. So, it's almost like Queer Eye for the company. That is a great idea. And I can see how it benefits the micro network tremendously. I can see how it could benefit the company, but I think it's a real stretch if companies are still trying to figure out how to adopt one fractional to get a team in there and say, yeah, we're going to hire a SWAT team to fix this. If you're going to hire a SWAT team, you're probably still in the market for a McKinsey or a PwC as well. So I don't see the micro networks, but I suspect that those are existing, again, below the waterline. As a fractional, I've embraced a lot of tools, and I've been able to figure out how to make my workflows way more efficient. And it changes every week, every month at the rate we're developing. So the ability to tap into people and micro networks, I think is there, but I think a lot of fractionals in this region don't talk about it. So they're not open with the company necessarily to say we're subcontracting or we're teaming up on this. They're taking the single face of the company, and they're the how it's delivered is sort of a never you mind kind of a question, as long as it's within privacy and confidentiality.
Yeah, that the fractional SWAT team is interesting. It's like a C-suite as a service, right?
Yes.
Or like co-founding team as a service, which kind of comes back to like makes sense for startups and SMBs. There's no way in hell I could sell that to an enterprise, I don't think, unless it was an innovation team.
And dear God, if your enterprise doesn't have any of the C-suite that you need, and you need C-suite as a service, I really wonder how you got as far as you did. So, I think there's also, again, the right tool for the right type of job. And for the directory, we've actually built it based not on titles, but based on very specific skill sets and deliverables to try to make that more accessible and more usable. I'd like to come to the company piece that you mentioned and the barriers that you see to adoption there. And just as a thought exercise, the reason we end up with SMB and founder-led startups in this space, think about the number of processes that need to change in a Fortune 500 company to accommodate fractional the way it is currently defined. And you touched on this. There is flexible for sure, because there are agency models, employers of record, service companies, and all of that. And all the way through the organization, from customer service entry level up to, let's say, middle management. I think still not much at the very senior executive level. But if you wanted to bring in a senior executive on a fractional basis, and you're an HR manager in a Fortune 500 company, where do you start? You've got pay equity to worry about. You've got job scoping and definition to worry about. You've got all of the unhappy workers who are already feeling like they're going to be displaced. And now suddenly you've got a new model where you don't have to be hired in. You've got benefits of the lack of benefits. We haven't even gotten to the legal issues involved in contracting, especially in markets like the US, which tend to be more regulated, the tax issues. That is a big ask for a company to hire one or a few superstars, even if they're going to remake the business. So my feeling on this and my hypothesis as to when these big companies start to think about this, number one, they will think about it when small and medium businesses start to eat their lunch and they realize that they've missed out on a huge source of employment talent that isn't looking for full-time anymore. And that's what we see in this region especially. There are a lot of people who don't want the full-time job, regardless of how you structure it. And then they're going to go in and they're going to hire a gigantic professional services company to answer all of those questions I just highlighted. And they're going to spend a couple of years and a few $1 million to retool their infrastructure to get there, by which time SMBs will have already eaten even more of their lunch. But I think it's hard to predict an outcome that looks different among all but the very, very few most innovative companies. And as you pointed out, the ones that have venture studios or innovation tiger teams are the ones most likely to try to test this in small pockets of the organization and then roll it internally.
Well, let me ask you a funny question, Mark. Let's see if you know. Guess how many platforms, and we're defining platform as anything that's in the middle. So it could be just matching, it could be matching plus managing, it could be scoping and matching. But guess how many platforms there are globally right now?
I cheated because I've seen your work. So,
Shit.
we're talking thousands of platforms
Yeah.
that are trying to figure out the different models here, that are trying to
Yeah.
think about how they can evolve, what level, what layer of services they can provide. And they look completely different from each other. And it's really interesting to see. But yeah, I know the human cloud landscape, if I can just plug you for a second, it's an amazing piece of work because you've cataloged, I don't know if it's everything that's out there, but it's enough to keep me busy reading it.
I appreciate it. It's like 20%. The visual is 20%. The data we have, we believe, is like 60%. But the tough part is that we refuse to scrape and
Mm-hmm.
to go and search, and so we're trying to like maintain the data effectiveness and integrity. So
Yeah.
we think we have like 60%, but we know we're missing intentionally, so that we have the good ones. But here's the tough part is, so you nailed it right, of like, hey, there's all these processes and systems that are just not there. I think the key problem is that there is no owner. And so when you look at other significant innovations and disruptions, I always go back to Salesforce, Mark, to be honest, of
Yeah.
like, hey, when are we going to be like Salesforce? Meaning, when do we have a conference that rents out a whole city like they do in San Francisco? Maybe we have a Salesforce tower, right? And the funny thing is, we do have two public companies. We have Upwork and Fiverr. And then we have a bunch of really good companies. And then we have a bunch of actually recently exited companies. So our space is actually kind of big. It's just very fragmented, not known. And we always put this slide up where like talent isn't sexy. And so even if you build a really good business in the space, you're probably not going to be on the cover of Forbes, unfortunately, right? We're just not that sexy. But to your point, what usually happens is, within the large companies, is it's a game of the business teams do what they're not supposed to. So they go and they use corporate cards, or they go and they hire these individuals as if they're vendors. Then the spend gets to around 1 to 10 million. Procurement goes, what the hell? Or HR gets looped in. And then they come to us and they go, human cloud, please give us a talent transformation. And it turns into a company wide talent transformation above usually the platforms. And it usually goes talent transformation, platform, individual. And that's like 3 levels, right? Before an individual even gets to the company. Crazy, man. Crazy, crazy, crazy. But
Yeah.
let's dig into the regional aspect of this, because I think that Asia is both giving a new playbook while at the same time accelerating an existing playbook. I will say, here in the U.S., things are things are pretty good from a freelance perspective. We're seeing like 15 to 35% growth, depending on how you look at it. Upwork and Fiverr's earnings reports this past quarter, really good. Yeah, we have deeper analysis of it. But there is a little bit of fatigue, meaning the older platforms are not doing as well as the newer, if they
Mhm.
weren't the big fishes already. But so, from an Asia perspective, what are you seeing? What do you think is unique about Asia? Even if you could give our audience like a little bit of the difference between like Singapore and the rest of Asia.
Yeah.
But yeah, over to you on the regional slicing.
Sure. So it's different, no question, but we have some of the same pieces and factors here. Upwork and Fiverr are global companies. We know we certainly tap into the global talent market through platforms like that. The first difference and the biggest difference when we think about Asia as a whole, but I think specifically Chinese ethnic Asian companies, I see this the most. You have a very, very strong culture of loyalty to employer. And that to some extent undermines fractional. So, what I mean by that is you have the need to stay in the office until at least 5, 10 minutes past your boss every day, or you're not considered to be a good employee. If you knock off early to take your kid to the dentist, the expectation is that you better be online at 11 p.m. that night, showing your devotion for the fact that you had the nerve to exit early that day. And
Yeah.
I'm intentionally overplaying the drama of this, but you cannot underestimate how important that factor is in a lot of traditionally organized and managed companies. And as I said, across the region, My direct working experience is Hong Kong and Singapore. It's extremely strong. Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, maybe not quite as strong an issue, but there is still a piece of that. What that does to flexible work or for flexible work or against flexible work might be the better way to put it. What that does against the flexible work model is it really creates a very strong culture of fear among employees to even try this out, because if they've had traditional working experiences, they think, well, what will the boss think? There's no way this model will ever work. So we're a small labor market. We definitely see disproportionate representation of long-term permanent residents, expats, other types of workers who may not have grown up in these systems in Singapore. That being said, the desire to embrace and innovate is extremely strong. And I've read in some sources a startup ecosystem that is rivaling Silicon Valley in terms of some measures of activity. Clearly not the total volume of funds, but perhaps the number of new business ideas and the number of startups coming out, the number of incubators operating to serve that ecosystem. It's one of the largest in the world at this point. And so there is a separate culture of innovation that operates outside of traditional companies where the rules are much more fluid and the gloves are off. Where we are with fractional and with flexible work in this region is there are a lot fewer regulatory considerations. Generally, it's a little more free and open within a labor market. Now, cross-border is obviously a different issue, but it's a little easier. It's a little more free and open to be able to work flexibly. You don't have quite as many of the tax considerations that you have in a regulated market like the US or the EU. So the development of various flexible working models on the employee side has been pretty fast and furious. When we launched the directory, we had pre-launch expressions of interest from 180 people. And within a week, I think we were over 200 in terms of what I call the supply side, the people working in this space. Less than a year later, we're over 500. So it has grown explosively on the side of people who are saying that they're operating in this model. On the demand side, it's still not coherent, not organized. And this is true across the region. It feels like we're early on the fractional movement compared to the US or even compared to Australia. But it also feels like we're reaching a tipping point, that more companies are inquiring, more interest is there in figuring out whether flexible work is a solution to the problems that companies are starting to see. The economies are slow. The risk levels are high. So I ran an event yesterday, how to hire a fractional. And that was targeted at the company side, the hiring side. And we had a tremendous amount of interest. It was a sold out event in the end. I mean, small event, but that would not have really moved the needle at all if we'd done that a year ago. And so what I'm hoping is that as we see this develop within the next year, we move from this being something that's completely unheard of to something that's kind of interesting to explore, to the final end state that people are actually really using this model and seeing the benefits, and it's become an acceptable alternative hiring practice within a broad section of the ecosystem. But I think the US has already got that. Australia's already got that, probably 60% of what the US does. Europe, you can tell me, but I think they're probably at least 50 or 60%. Asia's probably still 20%, but I see the potential for it to leapfrog. I see the potential for this to become a very new way of thinking, especially for companies facing significant strategic challenges and cash flow challenges.
I think the event we're gonna do together, Mark, is why the leapfrog, because I do think that is what. I mean, if we look at globally, to be honest, what's happening is the U.S. is still taking off. The U.S. has been growing 10 to 30%, honestly, since 1997, 1996, when it comes to just the flexible workforce. Europe, right? Like Europe is actually, and the reason's funny. I don't know if you're familiar with MBO Partners, but that actually stands for My Business Office. And in literally 1996, they started sending invoices for individual or independent workers This was in 1996. This was pre-internet boom. But we're seeing Europe is actually kind of plateauing, to be honest. We saw a 40% decline. What's tough about EU is that it's not all the same. So, like Germany, France, and Spain, they're not the same. So, it seems like there's actually lowest growth is Germany of all those. And I think it's a function of the volume actually was already there. So, there was less growth potential, but also some of the harshest regulation and just overall their economies are not doing as well as the others. But I think with the leapfrog, the two things that stand out to me is the fact that the legislative environment is not yet disfavorable, and they're probably not going to become disfavorable based off of learning from the EU and the US. And then I think the second thing, which is kind of related, is in my experience, I actually like that you put it of like the Chinese based. It's an interesting way to slice and dice it. Um, they seem to not get lost in the hype and read through the pragmatism. And one of the problems with when calling it the freelance workforce is that the term freelance is like 95% hype and 5% substance. And a lot of times US company this is what's happened 2019 and kind of right now. 2019 was when the freelance wave was just, I would say we were on wave 2 of it. It was strong, Mark. This was pre-COVID. Upwork had just IPO'd. Fiverr was in the process of IPOing, and everyone was talking about freelance, freelance, freelance. The problem was there was no substance to it. We couldn't answer why was it different than self-employment? Why was it different than interim? We really didn't have an answer. And so we lost it. And so it got put in the too hard bucket and it just got forgotten about. We're now in another wave, but I think this is where Singapore is different in Asia-based companies. Rather than sticking to the hype, they usually are a lot more first principled and engineering brain, in my experience. If you hear my dog is digging next to me in the carpet. But I think those two things really might power the leapfrogging. The fact that inherently the region is a little more pragmatic. Can you hear that, Mark? He is going to town digging.
I do.
You can hear that? Okay, for you listeners, this is not the first time they've heard that. So, yes, he's my little sidekick, but he'll start digging in the carpet. But what do you think about that, Mark? Like, what do you think, if we had to put a number to it, what would you say is the probability that Singapore will leapfrog, and what will drive that?
So leapfrog, by your definition around freelance, yeah,
Yeah,
80
I
to
would define it
90%
as,
probability. Yeah.
I would say a 50% growth over the next 50% growth of demand over the next 3 years. I would define as leapfrogging.
100%.
100%.
This is what I believe in. This is the business that we're running. Not just me personally saying, I want to be operating in this space for the long term, but we are investing in building this ecosystem and educating companies because we believe this is the right thing to do. And the government is behind that. I think that's a point that can't be stressed enough. So when the government of Singapore is behind something, the odds tend to go to 100% pretty quickly, if you're familiar with the way Singapore operates. So for all of my government partner listeners out there, this is not a commitment or a promise, but I see the need for, and again, we're defining this in the broad term here, flexible talent solutions to become part of the plumbing. We have demographic cliffs in Singapore that outweigh anything the US is facing. We have an extremely constrained labor market, and we're a knowledge and services based economy to a large extent. So when you bring those factors together, it's the perfect storm where you have people staying up at night thinking, how do we make this work? How do we make sure that our talent doesn't age out? And we're a high cost market. So how do we make sure that companies still see this as the center of excellence for the region and want to base their knowledge workers here? We have to provide solutions that ensure that they can get access to the talent they need. And in order to do that, we have to rethink where that talent is currently showing up, how that talent wants to show up, and how we can enable companies to hire that talent in the way that that talent wants to show up. So if I've got great people here who are past the official statutory employment age, this is one of the quirks that Singapore has in the regulatory space. If they're past the normal employment or re-employment age, do they still have value to the economy? Absolutely. Is there a way to access that? It's not as easy. And some of those people don't want to work in a traditional full-time role, nor do they want to work in a part-time individual contributor, drudge work kind of a role either. They want to be involved, contributing to the strategy and the execution as a senior leader, but not necessarily 5 days a week. So how do you untap the billions of dollars of economic potential of those workers? You have to create ways to make it easy for companies, because companies will not do it themselves until it's almost too late. And that's why I say 100%, because I think the government understands that here, is working and investing to make that happen. They've got the right mindset, they've got the right tools, they've got the right ecosystem partners. All the pieces are there to create that leapfrog.
Yeah. Mark, I'm going to hold you to that, okay? 100% of 50% growth over the next 3 years.
Let's book it in 3 years. I hope we'll do it in 2. Now, obviously, I have a horse in this race, right? I mean, the fractional directory is an enabler for this ecosystem. And we've created specifically a directory and not a marketplace. It's very light on monetization because it's an ecosystem play, because we believe that what really matters here is creating easy access to the supply for any company that wants to get into this space. Because any company that's struggling with this, they're thinking about who, how, what, where, and when, just like any good journalist.
Yeah.
They don't know the who, they don't know the how, they don't know the where. The when is starting to become very obvious, and the what is individual to every company. But we're solving the who and the where right now with a directory. It's like the Yellow Pages, right? In the olden days, before we had the internet, you'd go and you'd thumb through when you needed a plumber, and you'd go to Al's Plumbing or you'd go to ZZZ Plumbing, depending on where you started. And you'd say, hey, if they're a good plumber, that's a great place. Then we got Yelp and we got all of these other things. But the directory model came before the marketplace model. And we believe that's what's needed in this market still, is the directory model. And that's why we've chosen not to be a marketplace.
So Mark, I'm going to hold you to 100% probability of 50% growth in 3 years. And on that note, Mark, the most important question, where can our listeners find you? And what is the one thing you want them to take away?
So finding me is easy on LinkedIn. I'm really not on any of the other platforms out there. So LinkedIn is pretty much the one and only. The easiest thing to do is search the fractional directory, but I'm sure in the show notes you can throw me in there as well on my personal side. I'm spending most of my time pushing the directory side, but I'm operating on my own as well. The number one thing that I would leave your listeners with is, and it's so trite, but this fractional is the future statement. It is coming true in a variety of different ways across this ecosystem. And so I would change it slightly to flexibility is the future, not necessarily fractional is the future. It's not quite as catchy, but there are so many different ways to engage with workers that it can look like an absolute stew. But if you are not, as a company, as a hiring side, if you are not thinking about embedding these ways into your organization, you will begin to fall behind. Different regions at different speeds. But regardless, this is something that's going to be absolutely required, just as AI is going to be absolutely required.
I love it. Well, listen, on that note, Mark, thank you for hopping on. We're going to hold your feet to the fire, and exactly a year from now, we're going to have you back on, and we're going to say, hey, how we're doing? And you're allowed, because a year from now, you still will be able to be like, oh, we're only 10% there, but it's okay. We're going to have
a hockey stick, like every startup.
Hockey stick, yeah. So it's 2 years that you're going to be freaking out, but or it's 2.5 years. You're going to be like, oh shit. But I
That's
actually
cool.
have
I
confidence.
don't forget we're starting from a small base, man. We got it easy here, right? You tell me in 1997 you had like 5 guys in the space, and then you tell me 30% annual growth, right? Congratulations, but it started with just those first few. So I know we're in early days, and I will freely acknowledge that. It's a fun bet to put out there, and I think we'll accomplish it. But that doesn't mean we will have remade the entire economy. It just means that we're starting from a very, very early stage.
Here in the U.S., Mark, we're going from 444 billion. So for us, if we have 5%, still pretty good.
I
But
would take
listen,
0.1% of that, and I would say we've done amazingly well. So yes, we're obviously a slightly different league table at the moment. However, we will see what we accomplish. I love the idea. Let's come back together on this and see where we've gotten to.
I can't wait, man. We're going to be in person in Singapore, by the way. We'll be at Zion Center. I will pick. I will be having the dumplings.
Perfect.
All right, my
And
friend.
I'll tell you what. Let's make it a bet. Yeah.
Yeah, shake right now. We'll virtually
Perfect.
shake, and you're paying for my dumplings. And you cheap bastard, Mark, because it'll be $6, as you know. And I'm going to get a coconut just to really add on.
Oh man. Right. I better start budgeting for this now. But no, I'm going to win. I don't have to worry about it. You better start budgeting for this now.
Thank you for up and on, Mark.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me, Matt. Great to talk to you as always, and we'll speak soon.